Welcome to another edition of Teach the Geek interviews. My name is Neil Thompson. I am the founder of Teach the Geek. It's an online platform for science and engineering professionals. You can learn more about it at teachthegeek.com. Again, that's teachthegeek.com. Today, my guest is Dr. Norman Fortenberry. He's the executive director of the American Society for Engineering Education, or ASEE for short. You don't just come out of school and become an executive director, though, so I'm pretty sure he's done other things before then. So I'm really curious to find out what that was. He's actually got a number of degrees too, so I'm sure he's he must like school. So I'm going to ask him about that as well. So welcome to Teach the Geek interviews, Dr. Fortenberry.
Thank you, Neil. It's a great pleasure to be here.
Wonderful. So from the bit of research I did on you, I saw that you got your undergraduate degree in mechanical engineering. What was the motivation to get that degree?
Well, I've always been interested in how things work, how they fit together, what makes systems work. And so I was encouraged in, actually, I guess, starting in high school to think about engineering as a career field. I looked around at other professions and nothing else really seemed to encompass a focus on systems integration and how systems work. And so I decided to become an engineer.
Wonderful. And then I also noticed that you got a master's and you got a PhD too. So what was the motivation to keep going with your education?
Well, I come from a family that strongly believes in education, and more education can never hurt you. One. Two, if you're going to get more education, it's less painful to stay a poor and humble student than to get out, get a job, get used to having an apartment and a car and money coming in, and then turn around and have to go back to school. There's some challenges associated with that route. Oh, there's some benefits of maturation, et cetera. But it seemed to me that going straight through made the most sense to me.
It's funny you mentioned that, Dr. Fortenberry, because I actually had a guest not too long ago, and she did work as a design engineer for a while. She got her undergraduate degree in materials engineering and then decided to go back to school and get her PhD. And I remember thinking to myself, man, it would have been so hard for me to go back to school after, just like you said, getting an apartment, getting a car, getting used to having money coming in and going back to being a starving student. Like, man, you're used to eating prime rib and you have to go back to eating ramen noodles. I ain't doing it. But hey.
Although we should point out there are still a number of firms that have programs that allow working industrial professionals to return to school because the firm sees the long-term benefit in having the employee who they've already invested in stay with the firm rather than leaving entirely and going off to another firm, that they will provide stipends. There are some, I guess, old school, if you remember, Bell Labs used to have a 1 year on campus program for their employees to go back for master's degrees. Some firms have informal versions of that. Well, they will pay the tuition and maybe even a small stipend to keep you employed with the firm while you're in school. So that is a pathway that some can choose to pursue.
Yeah, all right. That sounds a little better as opposed to just going to being broke all over again for however long. Because with a PhD, it takes as long as it takes.
That too is true.
So you get a bachelor's, you get a master's, you get a PhD, you go all the way through. Now you're Dr. Fortenberry. You're not just Norman Fortenberry anymore. So what was next for you? What kind of work did you do when you came out of school?
Well, when I came out of school, I actually was briefly on faculty at Florida A&M, Florida State University, have a joint college of engineering. So I was in the Department of Mechanical Engineering there, and I taught design courses. And then actually fairly quickly, I went on to the National Science Foundation to become a program officer in the Division of Undergraduate Education. So I was an associate program officer, program director, and then a program director with increasing responsibility for grant programs, and then became staff associate with some responsibility for the management of the division. And then I left NSF, became executive director of the GIM Consortium, National Consortium for Graduate Degrees for Minorities in Engineering and Science, Inc. Came back to NSF as division director, was the first person to manage two divisions simultaneously, both the Division of Undergraduate Education and Division of Human Resource Development. And then staff senior staff associate in the office of the Assistant Director for Education and Human Resources. And while I was there, I think I also still held on to the undergraduate education portfolio. And after that, I went on to become the founding director of Center for the Advancement of Scholarship on Engineering Education at the National Academy of Engineering. It was their first operating center, depending upon how you count, maybe second. You count the Transportation Research Board, but I think most people would say it's the first, which really focused on taking engineering education research and then translating that into practical outcomes, practical knowledge for use on campus. So you could think of it as a translational research center, much as they have in medicine, where you take medical research and improve clinical practice. This was taking engineering education research and then translating it to improve classroom practice.
Wow. Something you mentioned, Dr. Fortenberry, I found really interesting. So, as I mentioned, you got your degrees, and from what I understand, at least historically, when you went to graduate school to get a PhD, the goal was to go into academia, and you seem to have followed that route, because you did say you worked in academia for a little bit, but then you left academia to go into administration. Was that always the plan, or what changed? Or if it wasn't the plan, what changed?
Well, so a PhD is not only for becoming a future academic. A number of industrial research sites use PhD engineers. So you're not limited to academia. With a PhD, you've proven that you can conduct independent research, that you can stay focused, that you can organize yourself. And so that's a useful skill set across a variety of fields of endeavor. For myself, the transition from academia, and it's only a slight transition. I mean, I went from being on a campus doing engineering, being an engineering faculty member, to going to the National Science Foundation, which is really a very academic environment. NSF and DoD provide most of the grant-funded research support in the United States to academic institutions. So rather than being a professor, I was paying other professors to pursue creative ideas to enhance the quality of education. Now, moving from NSF to NAE and now at ASEE, you're more on the professional society side, but still, I'm working with academics, helping them to do their jobs better.
Okay, but it does seem like a pretty interesting route that you've taken. I mean, you're the first person I think, you're definitely the first person I've spoken to that got degrees and then either stayed in academia or went into industry. You seem to have done a little bit of a different, I guess, had a different kind of path. Was that always the plan, or were you just kind of presented these opportunities and just accepted them as they came?
Well, yeah, so I don't know that there was a specific plan. My interest was and is improving the quality of undergraduate education. So across the thread of what I've said, as a faculty member on campus working directly with my own students, as a program director at NSF, funding very good ideas to improve the quality of undergraduate engineering education, as a center director at the National Academy of Engineering, translating engineering education research into practice to improve the quality of undergraduate engineering education. And now at ASEE, looking at engineering education, pre-college, undergraduate, graduate, and lifelong learning, there's a theme there in terms of attention to the quality and the content and the delivery of engineering education.
Yeah, no question. So based on the work that you do now at ASEE, how did your previous positions prepare you for what you're doing now?
Well, so the preparation, obviously, having been a faculty member, I can understand, although the knowledge base is getting a little old since I was last on a campus, but some understanding of what engineering faculty members go through. That helps in dealing with our membership. Our membership is primarily engineering faculty, but not exclusively. Anyone who touches on the education or has interest in a high quality engineering graduate is a constituent of ours. So engineering faculty, but also career counselors, student counselors, like engineering librarians, faculty in adjunct discipline, not adjunct, but nearby disciplines. So chemistry, physics, et cetera. Anyone who touches on the education of an engineer is of concern to ASEE. But in terms of how my previous positions helped me in my current position, and understanding what faculty do and what they go through, and understanding of some of the innovations in education that are supported by the National Science Foundation, both within engineering and outside of engineering that can be adapted to engineering. And then at NAE, working with really premier engineers in the nation within this center to translate research to practice and to highlight what works under what circumstances and with which populations.
Gotcha. I suspect that with the work that you did coming out of school at Florida A&M, being on faculty, it was important to be able to communicate with other people just because you're faculty, you had to teach classes. And then with the subsequent jobs, perhaps it was important as well. And at least for myself, I started this podcast and YouTube channel really to help people like myself get better at presenting in front of other people, because I get the sense that for so many of us that come out of engineering school, we think that having these technical skills is all we really need to do well at our jobs. But we quickly eventually we realize that being able to communicate with others, especially others who are outside of our technical expertise fields, people who are decision makers, and even more specifically, is something that we really need to get better at, or else we're going to be that engineer sitting in their cubicle mad because someone else got the promotion that we thought we deserved, but they were better networked, they were a better communicator, and they got the position. Eventually, I saw that. I wish I would have seen it a little sooner than I actually did. I ended up seeing it because I was a project lead at one of the companies I worked at. It was my second job, and I had to give presentations in front of management every month. And those first few presentations I gave were absolutely horrendous, Dr. Fortenberry. I didn't know it was possible to sweat that profusely for one's body. And I noticed a lot of the other engineers that gave presentations, they weren't all that much better at it than I was. But as I said, eventually I saw the benefit of getting better at just speaking in front of people. Looking back on your career, when did you realize that being able to communicate was going to be of benefit to you?
Well, let me answer more generally first. The emphasis that you have placed on what we now call professional skills, what used to be called soft skills, and soft was a derisive term that somehow they weren't as important or weren't as hard, but the ability to speak, to write, to communicate generally, to work in a team, these professional skills, to think broadly and integratively, these are the skills that are important if one is to succeed. As you said in your own example, if you have a brilliant idea, but you cannot communicate it, it remains a brilliant uncommunicated idea, and it goes nowhere. The ability to supervise others is a way to leverage your own work to get something accomplished. And so within the engineering community nationally, I would say going back to the engineering coalitions in the 1990s, and even before that with some earlier work, it was increasingly clear that if you wanted to be something other than, as you said, the engineer sitting in the cubicle in the corner, or the programmer sitting in the closed dock office where they slide meals under the door, you had to be able to engage with broader publics. That was one, just in terms of practical organizational politics. The other thing that drove that is that increasingly we are dealing with really thorny, complex problems in the engineering world. Engineers alone will not solve those problems. Engineering is about solving human needs, and to solve human needs, one needs to understand what humans need. That means working with the social scientists. It means working with humanists. And working across those boundaries means negotiating new forms of communication so that they understand what you're saying and you understand what they're saying. And together, collaboratively, you can you can provide solutions to real problems. There's an old saying that, nature has problems and universities have departments. So you got to work across the lines if you're going to solve real problems in the world.
Yeah, no question. I just remember having to give those presentations initially. When I eventually saw the need to get better because I was getting questions that I thought I had answered during the presentation, but because
Yeah,
I didn't put it in such a way that the people in the audience could understand, now I'm getting these questions. I was already sweating before before I was getting these questions, and I'm sweating even more. And so it was a waste of time for myself. It was a waste of time for the people in the audience. It was just a waste of time, period. So I definitely eventually got the message that this is definitely something that I need to get better at. Technical skills isn't enough. Just like
right,
you said, if you could have all the great ideas in the world, but if you're not able to convince a decision maker that it's a great idea, it just stays an idea. So yeah,
right.
I fully agree. So when it comes to just speaking in front of others, is that something you've always been good at? And if not, what did you do to get better at it?
Well, it's always, I guess it was an interest of mine. So in high school, I was in a speech and debate club, and my specialty was extemporaneous speaking. So I guess that was always a skill set that I had been developing. Um, how I got into that initially, I honestly don't recall. I'm sorry for all these beeps. I can't turn them all off. But the ability to communicate has always been an interest of mine.
Okay, well, okay, that's great. So you're one of the few people that I've actually spoken to that even from back in high school, you saw the importance of it. So when you got, I suspect when you finally started working after you finished all your education, that speaking in front of others wasn't as big an issue as it was for some of us.
Maybe not. It's still challenging to speak in front of a large crowd, and there's still a little nervousness there. But there are certain tools and techniques that you pursue that allow you to get through it.
Yeah, no question. Well, actually, one of those things I think that really hurts people is just the nerves, getting nervous before you give a presentation. Do you well, do you get nervous before giving presentations? And if so, what do you do to deal with your nerves?
You hide them. You hide them. That's about all you can do. Yeah, I mean, you always get a little nervous because you want things to go well and you want to plan. You're trying to think through what points do I want to make? Am I going to make them well? What you said in terms of the worst feeling in the world is to think that you made a point and then have people ask a question. It's like, well, I thought I answered that question, but let me try again. So, you just you hide the nervousness and you move forward.
You know, something I started to do is, I mentioned when I first started giving presentations, I used to sweat a lot. And I don't sweat nearly as profusely as I used to. But a way to I've been using to hide them is, instead of just wearing a long sleeve shirt where you can still see the sweat stains, I put you gotta throw a sweater over it. So they'll see the sweat stains no more. So according to them, at least from their perspective, I'm as cool as a cucumber right now. They don't know what's going
Okay.
on underneath that sweater.
For me, the sweat beads up on the forehead, so it's a little bit harder to hide.
Oh, you need to wear a hat. Wear a sweatband, you just go to the gym or something. So when it comes to the presentations that you do you have a process for putting them together? And if so, what is it?
I think through the main points that the audience or the point of contact is made in terms of the type, who the audience is, what their interest areas are likely to be. And then I think through, from my background and experience, what points do I want to make that audience is likely to have interest in, or maybe should have interest in, whether or not they actually do. And then you draft something. If it's written, well, you draft something, period. And then you refine it. You go through it again and look at it and say, okay, how are people going to react to this? If it's also going to have accompanying graphics, PowerPoint, whatever, you think through, how do I make the most visually impactful points? And then there's a trade-off between what is said to be what is best for a presentation, which is lots of white space, very few bullets, to also thinking about, well, if I were a consultant or something, it would be great to have very few bullets, because then people have to come back to me to unpack the details hidden in each bullet. On the other hand, if I'm going to talk to this group and then go away, and I'm likely the people who are in this presentation will not be contacting me again. I want to leave enough information in the presentation that they can go find the references, or they know some of what was packed in the bullet. So even though it's probably not the best visual presentation form, I will include sub bullets so that the basic thrust of the point I was making is clear from the slides themselves, so that I can say, well, I will leave this slide with whoever the moderator is, and I'm hoping that they're going to distribute the slides so that the people in the presentation will be able to get them afterward.
You know, that's a very valid point. The being able to go back to the slides and remember what was spoken about. You know, oftentimes when it comes to just being able to maintain people's engagement and attention during a presentation, you don't want a whole lot of wording on the slides, because
Right.
people will read as opposed to listening
Right.
to what you have to say. But I take your point where if just like you said, if you're not going to hear from these people again, you want them to be able to look at whatever you provided and remember, at least have it jog their memory as to what that was spoken about. I can recall a number of conferences that I used to go to when I worked as an engineer. I worked in medical devices, a product development engineer. And every now and then I'd have to go to these conferences. And let me tell you something, Dr. Fortenberry, if you are tired, don't go and sit down during an engineering talk. if you're going to go, at least stand, don't sit down.
Yes.
Or if you're going to go, take a cup of coffee with you, because those are some of the worst presentations I've ever sat through in my life. Oftentimes what people would do is they'd read. So they definitely took your point of having stuff on the slides, but at least in that instance, it wasn't, people weren't going to see your slides afterwards, but they still had all their stuff on the slides. They read, and I was like, I could read just as well as you can.
You can, yeah.
So, I mean, are you going to add anything else besides what you're saying? And the answer typically was no. So they'd read their slides, and then afterwards they try to get out there as quickly as possible. And I must say, when I first started giving presentations, I kind of did the same thing. I put a bunch of stuff on slides, read them, and then try to get out there as quickly as possible, but it never worked. So I definitely do take your point. Well, if you're not going to see these people again, then maybe you do have some stuff on the slides so they can refer back to. Although you also said that if you don't have all that stuff on the slides, they have to call you again and say, hey, maybe I do want them to call me again. So I put nothing on these slides. Right. You have to call me. But
I saw one presentation. Each slide had maybe 2 words in a picture.
Okay.
And so, I mean, it was an extremely engaging presentation to listen to. But unless you were taking real-time notes, you know, it was gone. You got the slides later. It's like, okay, I don't know what to do with this.
It's like, these are nice pictures, I guess. Maybe I can use them for a future presentation myself, but other than that, I got nothing to do with these. But so when it comes to just being an effective communicator, an effective presenter, what would your top few tips be to become an effective presenter?
The first is to understand who the audience is. And second is to understand the points that you want to make. I think those two are critically important. And then, as I said before, it's just, you know, you construct a presentation, both in terms of what you're going to say and whatever visuals you're going to use. The other, and everything else goes back to those first two, because, you know, depending upon the audience, do you want to be technical? Do you want to treat it as a general audience? That affects the level of what you say or how you say. Maybe use more analogies than strict technical terms. So it really does all come down to understanding your audience and understanding the points that you want to make. It's actually interesting. You don't want to get political, but just here, since we're here in the depths of COVID, if you look at and reflect on some of the presentations that have been done by the scientific community, where they're trying to communicate to a public audience that is not scientifically trained, the way they said things, a lot of them made sense for a scientific audience or a technical audience, but for a general public audience, people were just lost. The nuance, the hedging. So you have to know who your audience is and the points that you want to make.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. That's probably the number one rule when it comes to public speaking, it is knowing your audience. And that's definitely something that I wasn't taking into account when I first started giving presentations, but it was definitely something that I started taking into account once I started getting these damn questions that I thought I had answered, and I was now having to answer them just a second and sometimes even a third time. This has been really great speaking with you, Dr. Fortenberry. Thank you so much for being a guest. How can people get in touch with you?
My email is n.fortenberry, FORTENBERRY at ASEE, for American Society for Engineering Education, .org. So n.fortenberry at ASEE.org is my email, and then that's mostly what I live on is email. So it's the best way to reach me.
Excellent. Well, everybody, that marks the end of another edition of Teach the Geek interviews. My name is Neil Thompson, founder of Teach the Geek. It's an online platform for science and engineering professionals. You can learn more about it at teachthegeek.com. Again, that is teachthegeek.com. Until next time, take care and stay safe. Thank you, Dr. Fortenberry.
Thank you. It's been a great pleasure to be here.